Next, private parking companies operating at shopping centres, railway stations and airports. They've been a regular feature on Watchdog for issuing unfair tickets, ignoring customer appeals and using very heavy-handed tactics to chase payments. But new laws introduced a couple of years ago were meant to transform the industry. The British Parking Association, that's the trade body, was given responsibility to crack the whip. Is it doing its job? Or are some companies just stuck in the past?
Parking on private land used to be like venturing into the Wild West. Overstay and you'd fall prey to the private parking companies, and they were quick on the draw. Cars were clamped or towed away and tickets dished out willy-nilly. It was mayhem, and if you weren't happy, the only thing you could do was take the company to court. But 2 years ago, we were told all that would change. The government banned clamping on private land and told the industry to clean up its act. And so the British Parking Association introduced a new code of practice and appointed a new sheriff, someone who would mediate between drivers and parking companies in disputes. That sheriff went by the name of POPLA, Parking on Private Land Appeals. But it's clear that some companies are acting as if the new hired gun had never ridden into town. Like Local Parking Security Limited of Warwickshire, who dished out a parking ticket to John Hodgetts last November.
There was no apparent signs saying it was a pay and display car park, and clearly I didn't know, otherwise I would have paid.
When he initially appealed that the signs weren't obvious enough, the company rejected his challenge, and that is where the new sheriff is supposed to come in. John appealed to POPLA, meaning that any action to chase payment by the company should immediately stop. But Local Parking Security Limited took no notice whatsoever of the new rules.
I started getting demands from them saying that I owed them the money, and then I got further requests. They'd got a debt recovery company involved.
John even got this urgent text warning action can be taken and officers sent. It was a clear breach of Sheriff POPLA's rules. Not that they seemed to care.
I do everything by the book. I followed the POPLA appeals process. I don't normally get sort of stressed out by these things, but it wasn't very nice. I'd recently gone self-employed, so I was bothered about credit ratings and things like that.
John felt so intimidated that he paid up before POPLA ruled on his appeal, an appeal which, incidentally, he won. But while some companies acknowledge and then ignore Sheriff POPLA, others act like he doesn't even exist. Just ask Phil Kisin. When he parked in a private car park, he paid for his ticket using a mobile phone app. But in the time it took to process, he got a ticket from Premier Parking Solutions of Newton Abbot. But when they rejected his appeal, they ignored the rules.
There had been no mention of any right to appeal through any third-party adjudicator, and they wouldn't consider the matter closed until they had my £130.
And that is a clear breach of the BPA's code of practice. Any parking company rejecting a challenge must tell the motorist how to make an appeal to POPLA. Oh, and they should have provided a 10-digit verification code and an appeal form, but you guessed it, Premier Parking Solutions Limited didn't provide those either. In fact, the company's only advice to Phil was to pay up or face court action. Concerned, Phil contacted the British Parking Association. Surely they'd tell him about his right to appeal to their new sheriff. No, they didn't mention POPLA either. The BPA may have appointed a new sheriff, but it seems they don't actually want him to do anything, making him less John Wayne and more Milky Bar Kid. All the BPA told Phil was that they have no powers to cancel parking charges or intervene. What they failed to mention was that they'd recently set up an organisation to do just that. POPLA. So if the British Parking Association aren't telling motorists about the very organisation they set up to resolve disputes, what exactly are they doing? Not very much, it would seem. In order to chase a payment, parking companies need to buy an individual's contact details direct from the DVLA. The BPA has the power to ban them from doing this if they misbehave, but in the last year they haven't exercised this power once. All they've done is issue warnings. And there is no way for the public to identify these baddies, because on the BPA website, they're listed anonymously. For the AA, which has campaigned for years to clean up the industry, the current system still isn't working.
If there is a code of practice, it should be enforced, and if parking companies breach that code of practice, they should be punished. But quite often they're not. They get a slap on the wrist. So really we need tougher action, otherwise the code of practice isn't worth the paper it's written on.
The British Parking Association promised us the days of the Wild West were over, but old habits die hard. And the sheriff they brought in doesn't look like he's up to the fight.
Giles Long reporting there. Now, both of the companies featured insist they fully comply with the BPA's Code of Practice. Local Parking Security Limited says it was unaware that John Hodgetts had appealed to POPLA, so carried on with its normal debt recovery process. It says its signage is approved by the BPA, but has offered Mr Hodgetts a full refund. Premier Parking Solutions Limited claims it wasn't required to send a POPLA code to Philip Cousin, as he didn't appeal to them quickly enough, which makes no sense, as it was an appeal it fully considered and rejected. In fact, it says it's committed no transgressions at all in this case and continues to claim Philip was correctly ticketed, which of course Philip continues to dispute. The company says it fully supports POPLA and the appeals process.
OK, joining me now is the CEO of the British Parking Association, Patrick Troy. So, Mr Troy, here we are again. The British Parking Association still as useful as a chocolate teapot?
Well, what a massive change it's been, Anne, since I last saw you, because that was 2 years ago when we didn't have POPLA. And POPLA, since then, has had some 30,000 appeals going through its offices. That is a huge, a massive change to the way the private parking industry is working.
We have gone on getting hundreds and hundreds of complaints. The examples we've shown tonight are a very small amount of the sort of posts and emails we've been receiving. Can you explain to me, for example, why you would allow one of your members to have a bogus court document?
Well, the point about what's happened with the private
could you
parking
just
sector,
answer this question?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question.
So you didn't know that one of your members was using a bogus court document?
No, what happens...
What would you do now that you know?
Well, let me answer your question,
It
Anne.
is, that's what I'm asking you.
Yeah, well,
what will you do to this private parking company now you know that it's issuing bogus court documents?
That's exactly why we have a code of practice. That's exactly why we have a sanctions scheme to ensure that we can take action against operators who don't comply with our code. And
what action?
That happens day in, day out. You will know that we have expelled some 5 members.
How many
how
many in the last year have you expelled?
I think 2 of those 5 are in the last year.
You think, or you're sure?
I'm pretty sure that there are 2 in the last year, certainly.
And if you don't actually ban them, what can you do? What's your intermediate way of dealing with them?
Well, there are a whole range of ways of dealing with this, and what you'll understand is that the whole industry here has changed enormously over the last 18 months. These operators have now got processes in place to make sure that their customers get independent redress when they get a parking ticket. And that is something which has never existed before.
But even when one of these people we featured wrote to the British Parking Association, you failed to tell them about the adjudication.
It's not true, because the individual, I think that's Mr. Kaizen, isn't it, who wrote to us and said that he thought that there was a breach of the code of practice. We were concerned about that, and we wrote back to him and said, well, tell us more. He didn't let us know.
But you didn't tell him about the adjudication. You didn't tell him that POPLA existed.
We didn't know what stage he was at in terms of his complaint. We need to understand that.
You're happy with your behaviour, are you?
Well, I'm happy that there are 30,000 people that have gone through the POPLA service. You've identified 3 where there have been problems. I think 30,000 other people might disagree with you, and I think you do it a disservice to those 30,000 people by not recognising that actually we've got this sorted out now. People do go to the independent service, they do get redress, and half of those people have had their tickets cancelled.
I
2 years
think
ago,
our
that wouldn't
film
have happened
shows
then.
exactly the opposite, but thank you, Patrick Troy.